Ivan Pavlov, born September 14th, 1849 in Russia. He died February 27th, 1936 in what is now St. Petersburg. This guy was the son of a priest. He attended church school and theological seminary. Inspired by Charles Darwin and Shinov, he gave up his theological studies in favor of a scientific pursuit. This led him to attend the University of St. Petersburg, where he studied chemistry and physiology. After getting his undergrad, he received his MD at the Imperial Medical Academy in St. Petersburg in 1883. After receiving his MD, he studied under Carl Ludwig, a cardiovascular physiologist, and Rudolf Heidenhain, a gastrointestinal physiologist. Post-studies, his first independent research was on the physiology of the circulatory system. From 1888 to 1890 in St. Petersburg, he investigated cardiac physiology and the regulation of blood pressure. 1890 to 1924, he became the professor of physiology at the Imperial Medical Academy, where he performed surgical procedures on animals. From 1890 to 1900, Pavlov especially studied the secretory activity of digestion. He devised an operation to prepare a miniature stomach or pouch. This enabled him to study gastrointestinal secretions in a normal animal over its lifespan. This culminated in a book titled Lectures of the Work of the Digestive Glands, 1987. To the left you can see a copy of the cover of that book. Some Pavlov discoveries during this time is he formulated the laws of the conditioned reflex. It took him about 32 years to do that. He observed irregularities of secretions in normal, non-anesthetized animals. He used salivary secretion as a quantitative measure of the physical or subjective activity of the animal. He emphasized the advantage of objective physiological measures of mental phenomena and higher nervous activity. An important function of language function in humans is based on long chains of conditioned reflexes involving words. Pavlov said that language not only involved words, but elaborate generalizations not possible in animals lower than the human. Pavlovian conditioning, or classical conditioning. This was discovered accidentally. During the 1890s, Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov was looking at salivation in dogs in response to being fed, when he noticed that his dogs would begin to salivate whenever he entered the room, even when he was not bringing them food. In 1902, Pavlov started from the idea that there are some things that a dog does not need to learn. For example, dogs don't need to learn to salivate whenever they see food. This reflex is hardwired into the dog. In other terms, dogs do need to learn to sit, and it's something that is taught or practiced. In behaviorist terms, it is an unconditioned response, i.e. a stimulus-response connection that required no learning. In behaviorist terms, we write the unconditioned stimulus as food over the unconditioned response salivate. Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlov showed the existence of the unconditioned response by presenting a dog with a bowl of food and then measuring its salivary secretions in a measuring cup. Here's an image of an example of the setup Pavlov used. He'd connect the dog to all these wires. That tube going from his mouth is going into a container that measures the amount of saliva. Pavlovian conditioning continued. However, when Pavlov discovered that any object or event which the dogs learnt to associate with food, such as the lab assistant who would ring the bell, this would trigger the same response. He realized that he had made an important scientific discovery. Accordingly, he devoted the rest of his career to studying this type of learning. Pavlov knew that somehow the dogs in his lab had learned to associate food with his lab assistant. This must have been learned because at one point the dogs did not do it, and there came a point where they started, so their behavior had changed. A change in behavior of this type must be the result of learning. In behavior's terms, the lab assistant was originally a neutral stimulus. It's called neutral because he produced no response. What had happened was a neutral stimulus, the lab assistant, had become associated with an unconditioned stimulus, food. In his experiment, Pavlov used a bell as his neutral stimulus. Whenever he gave food to his dogs, he also rang a bell. After a number of repeats of this procedure, he tried the bell on its own. As you might expect, the bell on its own now caused an increase in salivation, even though there was no food. So the dog had learned an association between the bell and the food, and a new behavior had been learned. Because this response was learned, or conditioned, it is called a conditioned response. The neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus. Pavlov found that for associations to be made, the two stimuli had to be presented close together in time. He called this the law of temporal continuity. If the time between the conditioned stimulus, the bell, and the unconditioned stimulus, food, is too great, then learning will not occur. He applied this to many other examples. Pavlov and his studies of classical conditioning have become famous since his early work between 1890 and 1930. Classical conditioning is classical in that it is the first systematic study of basic laws of learning or conditioning. This is how the dog training kind of works. So there's food, there's salivation, and then before conditioning, they'd ring the bell, no salivation. During conditioning, the bell plus food equaled salivation, and then after conditioning, the bell alone would cause salivation. Classical conditioning involves learning to associate an unconditioned stimulus that already brings about a particular response with a new stimulus so that the new stimulus brings about the same response. When teaching, teachers are more likely to use operant conditioning. Operant conditioning involves things reward and punishment. Example of reward: great job, Timothy, you can go put a sticker on your chart. The punishment might be the assignment was not completed on time, so you were docked half credit. Classical conditioning may not be used as directly, but often can work alone with operant conditioning to reinforce learning. For instance, if the overall tone of the teacher's classroom is one of praise and enjoyment in learning, the student will associate this pleasure with the specific class and will be more likely to attend. Students who have learned to associate threatening or fearful situations with classroom experiences can have a more difficult time. An example might be anxiety while taking a math test from previous experiences with high-pressure timed exams. Don't freak out. In the classroom, teachers can be cognizant of the effects of classical conditioning on test anxiety and create a learning and test environment that reinforces a feel of calm and focus. When a student takes tests in a low-pressure, positive environment over time, the classically conditioned response will become extinguished or disappear. And finally, it is important to remember that unlike operant conditioning, classical conditioning cannot be suppressed by willpower alone. Reactions connected to classical conditioning are involuntary. It is possible to suppress behaviors, but not the urges associated with them. If the teacher uses candy to positively reinforce correct answers, students will pair success with the taste of sugar. If the teacher then stops using candy, even if she explains the reasoning of the change to the students, they will likely still crave sugar when giving positive answers. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. That is our presentation.